Our keynote address this morning is delivered by Professor Ian Harper. Professor Harper is a partner in Deloitte Access Economics, and more particularly from our perspective today, was the chair of the Competition Policy Review. Will you please make Ian Harper very welcome?
Thank you, Ian, or Minister Hazzard. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to everyone. And it's a real pleasure to be asked to address this one-day conference. I had the pleasure of speaking to a group of executives in the area through another dinner function that AHURI ran recently, and I was very encouraged by the amount of interest that there is in the ideas that the Competition Policy Review put forward. Ian told me he was going to run the poll that we just ran prior to my speaking, so I knew whether I'd be speaking to a hostile audience or not. You can be as hostile as you like, folks. I've spoken to taxi drivers, to pharmacists, to booksellers, to car sellers, to the big end of town, the small end of town. The Competition Policy Review had a very wide remit. And there are a lot of folk who love competition in principle, but they don't like it when it applies to them. I think we're all in the same boat. I'm exactly the same. Competition's great amongst the big four, but life can be tough when you're competing against other people. So Ian's asked me this morning if I would give you an overview of the Competition Policy Review, in particular the recommendations about competition and choice in human services. As you would be aware, the Competition Policy Review wasn't necessarily about human services. It certainly wasn't about housing in particular. But these two areas, particularly human services, and within that, social housing and the other areas of human services, education, health, and social services, became, if you like, a key focus of the Competition Policy Review because they were new ground for competition policy relative to where the Hilmer Review had left competition policy back in the early 90s. So that's the reason that this set of recommendations has really come to the fore. We were asked when the Competition Policy Review was set up by former Minister Bruce Bilson if I would, with my colleagues on the panel, if you like, reprise competition policy. We've had experience in this area. We've done this sort of thing before. We know that it works. So go back and have a look to see how far we've come, what needs to be changed, and are there any new areas that competition policy could potentially be introduced to. That's what brings human services into focus. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me just give you a quick overview of the process itself of the review to remind you where we are. The panel itself was set up in March of 2014, and that's four of us, myself as chair, Sue McCluskey, Peter Anderson, and Michael O'Brien, QC. Both Sue and Peter have moved on to other things. Peter used to run ACCI, Sue used to run the Regional Australia Institute. Michael O'Brien is a competition lawyer, a barrister of some distinction. He's still doing what he was doing then, and so am I, a partner at Deloitte Access Economics. There were the four of us who constituted the panel. We were assisted by a secretariat of 16, drawn mostly from the Commonwealth Treasury, but not exclusively. There was a Deputy Secretary from the New South Wales Department of Treasury was part of our secretariat, and people drawn from elsewhere across the public sector. So very strong support by way of officials for the work of this panel. We were given 12 months. Very quickly we kicked off with an issues paper that raised all the issues in the terms of reference. When former Minister Bruce Bilson called me in February of 2014 and asked me if I would do this job for the government, naturally I asked the Minister what it was the government had in mind. I'd read the newspapers as well, and there seemed to be a lot of fuss about small business versus big business and so forth, and supermarkets and petrol stations, which didn't sound like me. So I said, well, Minister, what is it the government has in mind? And he said to me, Ian, he said, the government wants Hilmer Mark II. Well, then in that case, I'd be delighted to accept. The Hilmer report, which as you'll recall, the Hilmer panel was set up by the former Keating government, Prime Minister Keating, in the early 1990s, and it really opened the door for competition policy for the first time, introducing competition into those parts of the Australian economy, primarily the non-traded goods and services sector, things like telecommunications, public transport and so forth, and utilities, introduced competition for the very first time. through a series of recommendations focusing on deregulation and privatisation. That had been very effective in driving productivity growth in the intervening period, and what it appeared that the then Abbott government wanted was another go at this, a reprise, a refresh for competition policy. As I said a moment ago, looking at the things that we said we'd do then that are unfinished business. That incidentally is where the taxis and pharmacies and booksellers come in. All of those recommendations were in the Hilmer report. They're 20 years old. Why was I talking about pharmacy location and ownership rules? Because they're unfinished business. I was asked to do, in the words of the government, a root and branch review, which I took to mean from the bottom to the top. So you open up all the cupboards and you look in every dusty corner and you see what's in there. Well, what's still in the dusty corner is pharmacy ownership and location rules, taxi licensing, parallel import restrictions on books and second-hand motor vehicles. No one, least of all me, is suggesting that by changing these things you will dramatically reform the future of the Australian economy. That's not the case. Why am I talking about pharmacy rules? Because I was asked to. They do need to change. We've been sitting there looking at them for 20 years. I've had another go. The opposition is as strong as it ever was. Well, maybe we'll never change these things. But somebody has to get up and say they are actually contrary to the welfare of consumers. We're not here today to talk about pharmacy rules. An issues paper in April, then a draft report, which we released in September. And when as I've had the privilege of doing a couple of times, are involved with these major public inquiries, ladies and gentlemen, I always believe it's very important at the draft report stage for the panel to actually tell the people what it's intending to say, unless it's persuaded otherwise. So our draft report in September was not, well, we might do this, we might do that. The draft report was exactly that. It was a draft report. These are the recommendations we're going to make, unless you persuade us that we're wrong and we should change our minds. Well, as you can see from the submissions, there's a lot of interest to begin with. 350 submissions. Once I put out the draft report, 650 submissions. That's what I want, right? Have I got your attention now? Okay? Suddenly people woke up and thought, oh my goodness. And of those 650 submissions, well, in fact, 1,000 of them you can see on the website if you're interested. You can see that those submissions range far and wide across all of the terms of reference. I was saying that I thought this was all about small business versus big business, but it wasn't. When the terms of reference eventually emerged, it was exactly as the former Minister Bruce Bilson had indicated. It was root and branch review, it was Hilmer Mark II. The terms of reference are very wide and extensive. So those submissions range widely across all of the issues that we raised. And there are many that are strongly in support, many that are strongly against. It's good public policy practice. Then people can read what everybody else has to say. And then as an official, quasi-official in this instance, seeking to draw a set of recommendations for the government, I can, when I go back to the minister as I did and hand the report back, metaphorically the minister says, well, did you ask the people? Did you test your ideas with the people? And I'm able to say, yes, Minister. Right? I tested the ideas in exactly the form that I was going to put them, and we made some changes in the light of what was sent back. And here's the final result, Minister, and there are all the submissions. So a bit like Ian's little poll, I've got a better idea, or the Minister has a better idea of what he or she is dealing with in that instance. So the report came out. It was submitted to government on the 31st of March, basically 12 months later as requested. November of last year, the government released its formal response to the review. You might have noted that at the time. You can find that response as well on the Treasury's website, the Commonwealth Treasury's website, if you've not seen it. There's my score for Victorians in the audience, 39,512. 39 of my 56 recommendations accepted outright, and 5 accepted in part, and 12 where the Commonwealth government remains open, as it's described. Well, in fact, since that time, you'd be aware the score's altered a bit. I'm now up to 40 recommendations accepted outright, 5 accepted in part, and 11 where the government remains open. It actually closed on one of those, which was the very contentious recommendation we put on Section 46 which deals with the misuse of market power. The government, and I commend the Prime Minister and the Treasurer and members of the Federal Cabinet for biting this particular bullet. I know, I'm sure it was worse for them, but I know how much power was thrown at this to try and get the government not to do what my colleagues and I recommended. The government toyed with the idea for a while of possibly doing what the Treasurer coyly referred to as a half-harper or a quarter-harper. When the Treasurer rang me up the morning after the Cabinet had made the decision and informed me that he would be announcing the government's decision later that day, he said, "Ian," he said, "I'm ringing to tell you that last night the Cabinet agreed to go the full harper on Section 46. And I said, "Well, congratulations, Treasurer, and to your colleagues on the Cabinet, because I know how much pressure you came under not to do that." Now, to be fair, there are strong opponents, people who still think that we're wrong and now the government is wrong to do that. Well, yes, there are two sides to the story. I'm not suggesting it's a simple lay-down misere. However, I think the government has made the right decision. I wouldn't have recommended that it do this, neither would any of my colleagues on the panel. We're unanimous about this, had we thought that it was the wrong decision. So there you go, 45 and 11. In fact, as the Treasurer made the point in November of 2015 when he released the response, the government has rejected no recommendation. Well, that's true. And the ones they've accepted in part are relatively minor recommendations where they've taken some bits and left others. But, you know, you'd have to say that this report has had a very good reception from the Commonwealth, and I'm very gratified by that, as my colleagues are. Now, not all of the material in the report is within the competence of the federal government to decide unilaterally. You'd be aware of that. Particularly in your area of human services, this requires agreement by the states and action by the states. The Commonwealth can't simply legislate to do these things. The area where the Commonwealth has basically the sole responsibility is amending the Competition and Consumer Act, which is an act of the Commonwealth Parliament. But even there, it has to get the assent of the states, because that's an area where the states have referred powers to the Commonwealth. So this really is an area where you need the agreement, essentially, of all of the jurisdictions, the Commonwealth, the states and territories, in order for us to make progress here. So we're making slow progress at this juncture, but the Commonwealth is on side, and the processes have begun through COAG to see where the states are. The most recent COAG meeting, as I understand it, our recommendation 1, which was to slightly revise the competition principles that underlie all of this, were assented to by the COAG jurisdictions. So we're on our way. But no one's pretending this will be a quick exercise. Why is competition important? In fact, Minister Hazzard was just giving us, I think, an excellent overview of how he and his colleagues are using competition in the area of social housing in New South Wales to drive precisely the sorts of benefits that we argue are important and available right across the economy. Well, competition in the final analysis delivers long-term benefits for consumers, oddly enough. It's the fact that sellers have to vie with each other to meet the requirements of fickle buyers, but puts the buyers or consumers in the driver's seat. It is the power of the consumer or the user to be able to say, no, I don't want yours, I want this one. That is a very powerful discipline. Immediately what it does is to put the provider on notice, and the provider has to stop and think, well, what do you mean you don't want mine? What's the matter with mine? Is it too expensive? Is it the wrong colour? Doesn't it do what it was supposed to do? Hey, what is this? If everybody says no to me, I won't be here. Those are precisely the disciplines that underlie competition as a driver, first and foremost, of meeting the needs of users and consumers. Right up front in the Competition and Consumer Act, it affirms that competition is about serving the long-term interests of consumers. And let me say at this point that the Competition and Consumer Act, and certainly the Competition Review Panel, neither did Hilmer, lionise competition above all else. Fred used to say, this isn't competition über alles. and I use that expression too from time to time, the competition principles, both those that emerged from Hilmer and those which were affirmed by the Competition Policy Review that I chaired, we both make the point quite clearly, and it's in the competition principles that have just been affirmed by COAG, that effectively what we're doing is giving competition the benefit of the doubt. In other words, competition won't always give you the right answer. But it's up to those who want to say that it won't work to demonstrate, again, as Minister Hazard just pointed out, do the cost benefit, to demonstrate why in this instance having competitive outcomes won't be in the public interest. So all of the recommendations that we have in this review, ladies and gentlemen, including these very sensitive recommendations in your area of human services, they're all subject to what we call the public interest override. And the public interest override is exactly that. Other things equal, we would expect competition to work here, unless it's not in the public interest. In other words, unless there are good overriding reasons why you wouldn't expect competition to work. And when we're talking about competition, remember, we're talking about sellers vying with each other to offer people things, potentially at all times of the day or night over the internet, irrespective of other social conventions or reasons that might apply. That's competition, pure and simple, a very powerful engine. Are there reasons or instances where you might want to switch that off? Well, yes, there are. So is it contrary to competition policy, for example, to restrict the sale of alcohol? To preserve the use of a very powerful symbol in our country, the Anzac logo, to forbid the use of that emblem for commercial purposes? That's not contrary to competition policy at all. In many of those instances, certainly in the case of the Anzac emblem, which has been essentially illegal to use for commercial purposes since the 1920s, as a community we have drawn that conclusion. Yes, of course it's true. Businesses using emblems like that, aligning themselves with popular social causes, trying to align themselves, albeit subliminally, with the values that underlie those emblems. I mean, they're always doing that. And in many instances, that's fine. Lining up with winning football teams or sporting stars, I mean, that's fine. But there's something that's deeply offensive to Australians about taking that and aligning it with the Anzac symbol, and so it's against the law. The body which made that choice then quickly reversed thrust and apologised and realised that it had made a mistake, apart from breaking the law, and went off in the other direction. Competition policy envisages situations like that, where competition, no doubt, would make the rivalry more intense, no doubt, possibly improve the quality of the service that consumers think they're getting by being aligned with a winning brand. All of that is commercially good, until it's not, basically, and those limits exist. So I want to make this, labouring this point a little, because in your area in particular, in human services, I don't want you to hear me say this morning, notwithstanding the results of the poll, which for me are very encouraging, I don't want you to hear me say that competition basically lays all before it, and any form of non-economic social objective should be steamrolled by the forces of competition. The Competition Policy Review does not say that. Competition policy never said that. My blood rises a bit on this point, ladies and gentlemen, because of course I have been accused by numerous interest groups of doing exactly that. Yes, that's right. I am the guy who wants to allow radioactive cars to be imported from Fukushima. I am the guy who wants to allow little old ladies, pardon me, and little old men for that matter, to have their medicines dispensed by an assistant in a supermarket who doesn't know the first thing about dispensing medicines to old people or anybody else for that matter. I am the guy. I am the guy who wants to flout regulations that apply to public transport and allow people to be assaulted in hire cars and other vehicles because I want to dispense. These things are all slanderous. And you know the reason why. There is nothing in competition policy which suggests that anybody apart from an appropriately credentialed and licensed pharmacist would dispense medicines to the public. Old, young, whatever. Nothing. There is nothing in competition policy which says that we should abolish and suspend rules which are designed to screen people who are offering driving services to members of the public, and that we would keep out of that business people who are convicted criminals or who whatever, abusers of children and whatever. Right? There's nothing in competition policy which says that we should abandon those rules. That is an attempt on the part of those who are protected by current arrangements to avoid the need to meet their customers' needs. It's as simple as that. So regrettably, I need to emphasise that competition doesn't sweep all before it, and that we're not saying that therefore no other argument stands against competition. We're not saying that. But neither are we saying simply because things are done the way they're done, they should stay the way they are. We're not saying that either. And in the case, for example, of taxis, I say to the taxi industry, yes, I hear what you say about people being assaulted in taxis. I don't want that either. But how does restricting the number of taxi licences protect innocent women in public vehicles? How does restricting the ownership and location of pharmacies protect people from having the wrong medicines dispensed to them? It's that link which I keep coming back to in talking to groups who are concerned about this. For that matter, how does limiting importation of second-hand cars, how does that protect people? In and of itself, just limiting that, protect people from having motor vehicles that might happen to be exposed to radioactivity in Japan. You see, these rules that are put in place, in the end, are not rules which serve the interests of consumers. They look like they could be, but they're rules which have the convenient side benefit of helping out the sellers, the providers. And that's where competition policy has something to say. So competition delivers long-term benefits to consumers. It drives choice and efficiency and innovation. Simply, as I indicated before, giving the person the right to say, no, I don't want yours, I'm going down the road to buy this one, right? Drives efficiency. The seller is forced then to think more carefully about how he or she goes about business. Drives innovation, coming up with something shinier, better, with more functions, different colours, whatever it is, to meet the consumer's needs. And by doing that, it contributes to productivity growth and higher living standards for Australians. That is the end game. So let me pull right back to the wide focus and show you this chart, which is drawn from the Federal Treasury's intergenerational report. This chart shows you, if you look at the line, it shows you what's happening to the growth of real national income per person. A real national income per person is our average living standards. And this chart is showing you how what rate at which they've been growing over the last few decades. It shows you, as you see in the forecast there, what we're expecting in prospect. And it shows you how the growth in real national income per person is comprised of the various factors that drive it. You're talking here, folks, about living standards, our material living standards. And what you see on that chart, first and foremost, just look at the line. You see that what we're living through at the moment, and are likely to be still living through for the next 2 decades, is a dramatic slowdown in the rate of growth of national income per person. This is already showing up in wages growth. Wages growth has now slowed to a crawl. You're seeing it in the slowdown in housing prices as people's demand stopped. You see this in the slowdown in retail sales. And my colleagues and I at Deloitte Access Economics are not predicting a recession in output. This is income. Income is already falling. Output is still growing, but income is falling. How can that be? Because the terms of trade are falling. See the dark line at the bottom of the chart there. The terms of trade are the prices of our outputs. What we get, what we can buy with the things that we sell. Those prices are falling. So even if we produce more of the stuff, which is what we're doing, It doesn't buy as much as it did before because the price is going down. That's happening because of China and all the rest of the story we won't go into today. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we are facing a substantial slowdown in the rate of growth of real income per person and all that means. Now, you work in the area of social services, so you'll know what the implications of this sort of thing are for some of the weakest members of our community. This is not good news. As the economy slows down, generally speaking, it's those who are furthest back in the pack, so to speak, who cop this hardest. And this isn't just a passing phase. Why not? Because the changing of gear of the Chinese economy is going to take quite some time to work its way through. Eventually, the terms of trade will swing around, as you can see for another forecast out there for 2025, 2055. By that stage, the terms of trade have basically stabilised. Now focus on the green line, or green bar. The green bar is the contribution to real national income per person that comes from productivity growth. So yes, if you produce more output per person, then in principle you can distribute more income per person. And when the terms of trade have stabilised, then output growth and output growth and income growth will be the same when the terms of trade have stabilised. The biggest lever we have to try and shunt up the rate of growth of real national income per person closer to what we've experienced over the last 20 or 30 years, you can see from the chart, the biggest chance we have of doing that is by making the green bar longer. And we did that during the 1990s. Look at the 1990s. That long green bar was the result, effectively, of Hilmer Mark I. Hilmer Mark I unleashed a round of productivity growth. If you take that green bar sitting there in 1990 and shunt that along to the 2014-2025 bar, the one that's circled there in red, so replace the green that's there with the green from the 1990s, and you can see that we would push real income growth per person much closer to the 2% that we've experienced in the past. That is what competition policy reform is about. That's the point. That's the point. Right? Can't we fire up competition policy as we did before in the 1990s under Hilmer? Can't we make that do its magic again for the decade 2014 to 2025 and ideally beyond? To what end? To try to reverse what will otherwise be quite a rapid slowdown in the rate of growth of real national income per person. Why should we care? This is about people's lives. This isn't just about how large a house they can live in and how big a car they can. No. This is the tax base. You want to know why the national tax base has been shrinking and why the Commonwealth government's budget is in chronic deficit. Here's the hand behind the arras. How do you reverse that? Apart from cutting government expenditure. How could you avoid having to cut government expenditure? How could we avoid having to walk away from some things that we want to do? More income per person. And how do you get that? One answer is competition policy. So that's the name of the game. It's about driving the reforms to build on the things that are done in the past. We've had experience of this, as you can see. Hilmer Mark I, the public utilities through deregulation and privatisation, particularly here in Victoria. We've lived with that now for 20 years. We know what that looks like. Choice of electricity distributor, international companies running our trains and our trams. No one's suggesting these things are perfect, but they're a whole lot more efficient than they were in the past, and that's documented by the Productivity Commission. What we wanted to do on the Competition Policy Review is to expose this same discipline to core government services. Fred Hilmer and his colleagues left competition policy at the government's front door. We said, take it in through the front door and use the same disciplines of competition policy to drive competition in the core services of health, education and welfare. Why? They are the fastest growing area of public expenditure. Health is one of the fastest growing industries in the Australian economy. if you can realise productivity improvements in there, that will show up on the national radar screen. If you want to raise productivity growth, then that's where you would go to get the big bucks. Now again, let me take a sidestep here and say when I'm talking about productivity growth, I'm not just talking about cutting costs. Productivity is a ratio of the value of output per unit input. If we can do things which deliver more value to people, even they cost a bit more, productivity will improve. So introducing consumer choice and competition to human services, yes, it is about realising cost savings where we can, but it's also about improving the type of service that people receive. In some cases, that might cost a bit more, but the productivity improvement will be there to be reaped. What Hilmer did was to seek to separate policy, funding, regulation, and provision. So yes, the government subsidises our public transport services here in Melbourne, but the policy that's set about our public transport is separated off from the provision. The funding is handled separately again, and the activities that the private providers engage in delivering our train and tram services are regulated and overseen by yet another body. Separate this up, and you drive efficiency and quality of service by doing that. This logic simply says, take that and move it into core government services as well. It's important because our public outlays on human services are growing fastest, but beneath that, our public services, our human services, are amongst the most important services that government delivers because they affect people's lives very directly. I don't need to convince this audience of that. So here are a set of quick principles then you'll find what we say in the Competition Policy Review boil down to for human services. First and foremost, to promote user choice. The Minister spoke about separating provision from funding and regulation. And we've been down that track, and it's important to go there. One's not backing away from that. Right? But this says take the next step. Actually put the power of choice into the hands of the individual consumer where you can do that responsibly. So we're not thinking necessarily outsourcing these services to the private sector. We're thinking NDIS, the next step. The service is outsourced and actually driven as far as possible by the user, by the consumer. Ladies and gentlemen, if we can give those choices to Australians with a disability, why can't we give these choices to Australians across the area of human services? That's the idea. I will never forget the interview I had with one Australian gentleman who was disabled and had a disability for many years. And he just simply said to me, when I asked him about the NDIS, he says, mate, he says, there's nothing wrong with Meals on Wheels. He said, I've had Meals on Wheels delivered to me for most of my adult life. He said, but under this new system, you know what? He says, I can have a beer and a pizza whenever I want one. And I thought, God bless you, brother. Right? There is a simple choice that I just take no notice of that because I live my life every day exercising little joy. For this man, the right to pick up the phone and say, not tonight, I'm having a beer and pizza. And who decided that? Him. He decided, no, I don't want yours tonight. I'm doing something different. What is that, because Meals on Wheels? No, he said that. No, Meals on Wheels, mate. That's fine. Right? But tonight, I want a beer and a pizza. Another chap, rather more poignantly, said to me, he said, mate, there are a lot of things that have to be done for me because of my condition. And I said, I can imagine that. He said, oh, yes, I know what you're talking about. He said, that has to happen too. And I'm talking about my finances. I said, oh. He said, yes, he says, I have to get somebody to manage all my finances. He said, it's a bit intimate. And it takes me a while to get comfortable with someone looking after my money, let alone doing the other tasks that need to be done for me. And then he said, there's one thing that cuts me to the core. Is when the agency suddenly turns up with somebody else. And I say, who's this? And they say, oh, this is your new carer. He said, do you have any idea? Any idea what that does to me? He says, under this system. Now I can say, no. I've got nothing against you. That's not the point. No. Right? And if I have to pay more, I will pay more. I want this person, not that person. Nothing against you. Now, some of that may be a little naive. It may be taking it further than it's intended to go. I'm just making one point. Do you see the power and the dignity that comes to ordinary people when they have the right, as most of us do in this room, every day to say, no, thank you, I prefer this. Right? And then think about the discipline that imposes on the provider, particularly in your area where the provider is not used to having someone say no. Provider's going, what? Excuse me? Did you say no? That's what I said. Completely changes the culture. I'd like to think it changes the culture in a way which promotes the public interest. That's a discussion that we'll have to have. There will be some instances where that might not be true. Separating policy, funding, regulation, and service delivery, you get the idea. These are not ideas, ladies and gentlemen, that have come out of some textbook that some academic like me has dreamt up. We've done this. We have a track record. We can measure the outcomes in the areas of other public services. What we've recommended to the Commonwealth and to the other jurisdictions is keep pushing, push this further. If you can do this for Australians with a disability, surely you can do this throughout the health and education system and other areas of social services, including social housing. Let's try and see if we can't make it work. Commissioning, again, I'm just repeating the Minister's earlier remarks, should have a clear focus on outcomes. This is about getting outcomes for people. It isn't just about process. And the other great beauty of letting the users decide is that you encourage a diversity of provision and innovation. The group to whom my friend is saying no, right, have to think about different ways of providing services, offering a bit of innovation in the way they deliver the services so that he mightn't say no again. There is no incentive for that to occur unless the user can say no. And that's what user choice is all about. So we've simply said, as far as is possible, take these services into the humans, these disciplines into the human services area. But I don't want to be doctrinaire, and I don't believe the report is doctrinaire. I'm very well aware that there are limitations to this, and we need to explore those limitations, but not let that be an obstacle. Finally, on implementation, the Commonwealth has already commissioned a review from the Productivity Commission to lay the groundwork for the reforms that we've recommended. That is in process. They're expecting to review past and ongoing reforms in different jurisdictions and to identify sectors and subsectors for detailed analysis. The report itself recommends that we start this process nice and slow. Let's have some trials. Let's pilot. Let's share the results. This isn't about big bang. We don't want to make a mistake, but neither do we want to walk away. The difficulties which are no doubt there should not mean that the reforms are simply abandoned. There's too much to gain here. But that isn't to say that there aren't tricks and traps for unwary players. And finally, how hard will all this be? Well, we've made a start. There are elements of consumer choice, as you well know, in aged care, vet, the NDIS I've mentioned, social housing. So it's not completely new. Are there mixed results? Yes, there are. In some cases it's worked well, in other cases it hasn't worked well. What do we learn from that? One size doesn't fit all. We do need trials across different services and locations, and the Federation is made for that. We can have different jurisdictions trialling different things, sharing the results. In the report we recommend the creation of a special council to oversee that activity across all of these areas of human services, but beyond that too, into transport as well. User choice will challenge the established cultures of service delivery. That's my point. When you give power to the user, you change the whole culture that surrounds service delivery in this area. And I made the point to you that productivity is much more than simply cost efficiency. What excited us about these reforms in human services, folks, and this is your daily life, is the capacity here to use the discipline of competition wisely to improve the dignity of people's lives is probably greater than it is elsewhere. Yes, of course it matters in supermarkets and books and cars. Those things are all important. But here we're talking about using the discipline of user choice and competition to drive outcomes for some of the most vulnerable members of our community, which is why we need to do it very carefully. But in the report, we believe those folk deserve the benefits that competition can bring equally to the rest of us who use competition every day in the open marketplace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this absolutely terrific. I've got numbers of questions coming in over the app, but I'll also take questions from the floor as well. So I've got one right there, Brian, microphone there, and then one at the back. We'll do a couple from the floor first and one at the front here. Thank you. Yes, please.
Brian Lippman from Winteringham. Thank you for your presentation. I'm really delighted about your work because I remember at the Hilmer report there were a lot of comments about its applicability to human services, and I remember him saying, but I really wasn't looking at human services as much as the rest. But, and I certainly don't want to feel that you should be accountable for everything that's done in your name. But I am interested in the issue of protections. In aged care, for example, the CDCs have come in, that's consumer-directed care.
Yeah.
And there's no doubt for my mother, when she was alive, it would have been wonderful to have a reasonably articulate son to fight for her, to get her choices, and not just be respondent to
whatever was
to the services which she got, which were pretty poor.
Yeah.
But I work with some of the most disadvantaged, brain-damaged, elderly, homeless people, and it doesn't work for them at all.
That's right.
It simply doesn't work. It's ludicrous to think some of our damaged people can make rational choices with their limited funds.
Yeah.
And while the government is see people in Canberra are saying yes, it works for 95%, it doesn't work for 5%.
Yeah.
But I mean, these are the problems with these sweeping mass movements, like Kennett and privatisation, or someone else and some other thing. It's just another great big development. But how do you look at these protections for you're talking before about very vulnerable people, but that's exactly the group that are suffering.
Yep. Well, thank you, Brian, for that. And believe me, mate, I feel for exactly what you're saying, right? Years ago, I was involved here in this state in an inquiry into the metropolitan public hospitals. And one of the things that I was asked to look at, along with some others, was the impact of essentially moving from institutionalised care for institutionalised psychiatric care to a much more community-based care arrangement. And I well remember the case of a chap I was introduced to who was living in just above where the nurses' station was, with 2 or 3 others, and seemed fine. I mean, I'm no judge of these things, but he was perfectly sensible to talk to and so forth. And I asked the doctor afterwards how he was getting on, having been deinstitutionalised. He said, from all reports, it looks fine, he says. He's able to decide when he wants to come and go now. As a matter of fact, he says, we discovered that he goes at 3 o'clock in the morning up the street and lets himself into his mother's house and visits his mother. We let this happen 3 or 4 times, and then we asked him, and we said, well, Jim, you realise you can come and go when you want? He says, I know that. And they said, well, and you visit your mother at 3 in the morning? He said, yes, I do. And they said, well, you could visit your mum perhaps at another time of day. And this chap said to the doctor, and the doctor told me, he said, he looked at me and he said, for 40 years of my life, I couldn't see my mother when I wanted to see my mother. If I want to see her at 3:30 in the morning, that's all right, isn't it? And while he'd finished telling me that story, somebody else in the background, there was a piercing shriek. And the doctor looked straight at me and he said, Professor Harper, he says, not all of our patients will make it. There are many who need institutionalised care. So I've seen that and experienced that, not just in that instance, but other instances as well, front up. Brian, I agree with you, mate. The one solace I guess I can give you is that there is no way in which the state can walk away from its ultimate responsibility. It might try, but it can't. And the people will hold it accountable. What I'm trying to say is this. Let's not let the state say, well, because we have to protect the 5%, as you put it, the 95% will put up with whatever we offer. We can't offer both. I'm saying we can do better than that. I'm certainly with you. Don't you leave the 5% behind. Maybe it's 10, I don't know, right? But let's give choice where we can to the bulk of people who are receiving these services for their dignity as well. That's what I'm trying to say here. I've tried to word that chapter of the report as gently as I can, because I'm trying to avoid the doctrinaire point you're making. This is an invitation for us to think about a different way of doing it. One final point on this one, Ian, is that, you know, my father and his parents, my grandparents, a bit like you were saying about your mum, they would take whatever was offered by the state because there was no alternative, and they were grateful for it. My generation, I'm a baby boomer, we're used to getting things the way we want them, not just for us, but for my parents. So it's my father who says, no, son, it's all right, it's okay. I said, Dad, that's not good enough. I'm ringing up and doing something, just like you with your mum. Huh? Now you think about the next generation down, and the next generation down. Right? They are not going to accept the state simply handing stuff. You can have any colour you like so long as it's black. So the other dimension to this, ladies and gentlemen, is that I think while we have the chance now, we should be building a system which allows choice, which will be foisted upon us anyway, to be built carefully and sensibly. Otherwise we'll find ourselves in a situation where we're being overwhelmed by the demand for choice through the electorate, through the ballot box, when our systems are not ready for it. That's why I say this is a stitch in time, right, to save ourselves 9.
We're going to take a couple of questions and get Ian to respond to those. So one at the back here, and then I'll come over to table 14. Thank you.
Lily McMahon from Serco.
Yeah.
One of the questions I have is about the challenges in terms of the cultural shift within the industry to deliver services.
Yeah.
And I've just spent a couple of days working with the not-for-profit sector, and the conversations we were talking about was a term that I like to call co-opetition,
Yeah.
which is, I suppose from an industry perspective, it's viewed with some fear and anxiety that we used to collaborate together to deliver services, and now this is a whole range of competition and we're no longer doing that.
Yeah.
So one of the terms that we use is there are times where you work together
Yeah.
to deliver services, and there are times where you partner with other organisations to deliver services. How do you see breaking down that cultural barrier?
Well,
I'll just take one more question.
Oh,
so I'm going
sure.
to double load them if I can. Over at the back there, thank you. Yep.
Hi, Caroline Wong from Nous Group. I actually had 2 questions, but if you've
Just
got
go
a
with
short, if you've got a short amount of time, just the first one,
Yeah.
which was, what are your views about how to best foster competition in rural and remote areas of Australia where
Yeah.
the population is such that maybe there aren't enough service providers operating?
yeah, terrific.
Cultural change.
Can I do the cultural one first? Absolutely, I've had the same conversations. There's a shock, right? This isn't the way we do things. Let me say the way in is through user choice, right? Who wants to deny people? So you're telling me you don't want to hear what your clients want? I mean, I thought you were serving these people. Does it not matter, right, what they want? You're serving them. Well, if they change their mind, you should change the way you serve them, right? Second point is that in this area, I find, it's changing, but in the areas, particularly not-for-profits, there is a suspicion of what competition and commercial processes can do, right? And a sense that somehow this divorces us, as you say, from dealing with other people. It forces us to be thinking only about the bottom line. I think that's a naive interpretation of what commercial life is like. Commercial life is filled with examples of what you describe as co-opetition. Joint ventures, alliances, obviously leading up to takeovers, but all the time we're working with other of our competitors to produce or to serve the customer, whatever makes sense. That's a fluid environment. So I would encourage, particularly people who aren't used to a commercial environment, not to blackguard the world of commerce. Understand that the incentives that drive your competitors will sometimes drive you to create these joint ventures. Right? Not-for-profit world is not the only world in which cooperation takes place. And at the end of the day, we're all independent agents working in the labour market. We cooperate with our colleagues in workplaces, and sometimes we decide to leave. Right? Those choices are there for us. So I think it is a cultural change, absolutely, introducing user choice, getting people to think more broadly about how the world works. You know, I get fed basically every day. I can get my food brought to my table. Every one of those people is a competitor. And how is it that they end up cooperating. The farmer, the baker, the butcher, the delivery. How does all that happen? That's Adam Smith, right? Through their regard to their own self-interest, they produce these systems for us. On rural and remote, again, the state will need to build capacity for this to happen, and in some cases, it won't be possible to build it or it'll be too expensive, in which case the state will continue to deliver the services. So I had a long conversation, as you might imagine, with the Tasmanian government, the officials there who love all these ideas in principle and start raising the examples that you're pointing to, and the Tasmanians aren't unique. In those instances, the state will continue to have to meet its obligations. All I'm saying is, let's try to find alternative ways in which we could do it, but if it doesn't work or isn't efficient, then the state is the provider of last resort. That's correct.
There are a number of questions that have come in over the app pointing to sort of experiences either overseas or more recently sort of in Victoria with technical and vocational training failures there.
Yeah.
I might just get you to think about, what do we do with those things? I mean, are they...
We learn from them,
Yeah.
right? You know, that there is... Now, I say that seriously. I don't have a crystal ball, folks, and if anybody does, stand up, you can have the job. I haven't got a crystal ball. What I'm trying to do is to say, you know, the world is changing. The generations are changing. People's tastes and aspirations are changing. And frankly, we feel we want to offer a better calibre of service. But people deserve this. This is a civilization. It's a community. Well, here are some ideas and structures, some of which could be applicable. Let's do the work and see where they are. How do we find out what works and what doesn't work? You study. You do what they do in medicine. Down you go, right, to the autopsy room. That's how you find out. And so here we're doing the same thing. Let's go to the equivalent of the autopsy room and find out why that patient died. Find out, right, what happened here. Where was the mistake made? In order to learn how to make the system work better in future. So it's about taking a bit of advice from William Osler and actually going and taking a look and deciding from what we learn how we can improve our behaviour. So obviously, Ian, I'm not trying to say that this is a panacea. I'm trying to say here there are ideas that have proven powerful in related parts of the system. And rather like Brian's original observation, I'm saying now is the time to take this into human services, but let's do so intelligently, in an informed way, and let's try it on a little square of carpet first, before we spray it across the entire floor.
Get some questions from the floor. I've got Michael, and then I'll come to Owen.
Ian, Michael Lennon from Housing Choices. When Hilmer was implemented, like many of the organisations here today, the focus was in areas which exist in the complexities of the Federation, with unequal and diverse roles and responsibilities between Commonwealth states, private providers, not-for-profits.
Yeah.
One of the methods that was successfully applied in the reform of the utilities was through the provision of financial assistance from the Commonwealth to ease the restructuring, indeed, in some politicians' terms, to buy reform. In the areas we're now working in, where there's an enormous scarcity, especially in the housing field, for the services we seek to provide, there appears very little prospect in the short term of the Commonwealth especially, but indeed the states being able to do that. So what is the method through which the momentum for reform in this next environment might be successfully applied in a Commonwealth state and other interest environment?
Michael, that's an excellent question. You want to take the one first?
Yes, if I can. Yeah, I'm going to load them up. And Owen, please.
Thanks, Ian. A question about the role of price signals and consumer choice. In housing, particularly in social housing, consumer choice has basically been non-existent.
Yep.
You either have a choice of taking something or knocking it back, and can't afford to knock it back.
Yeah.
There could be choices now potentially about the provider, about location, about types and styles of housing, about extra services and possibly some other things. All of them cost money, will have a different price. Without a price signal, how does consumer choice, as opposed to the payer choice, the
Yep.
state.
Yep.
How does that get exercised?
Yep.
And is there a place for price signals in this marketplace?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Can I add a rider on that one too from the app, which is about the nature of housing and its substitutability compared to other sorts of services.
Your point being?
There's a shortage of it.
Oh.
There isn't a ready sort of, I don't want that one, I'll take that one.
So how do you address
Is housing a particular good that means it needs to be thought of differently? So.
Okay, thanks for that. First to the questions of compensation. Right? Yes, Hilmer talked about a series of so-called competition payments. We talked about competition payments. The trouble is we weren't given a pot of money. We weren't asked to talk about how that would be raised. We say competition payments are a good idea and the jurisdictions respond to them. Right? Had it been the case that the GST, the government decided to put the GST up to 15%, I think there might have been some scope for those payments then to the states to be made conditional. I don't think the Commonwealth has given up yet, not on the GST, it probably has on that, but given up on the idea of making some payments conditional. That's sort of lurking in the background there. So the logic of what you're saying hasn't been lost. What it will look like, I don't know. But some compensation, yes, is required. The other point to make is that this doesn't just apply to human services. The New South Wales government is now, having bitten the bullet on taxi regulation, is now talking about what sort of compensation regime to put in place for people who will be dispossessed of the value of their taxi licences. Right? Again, this isn't competition über alles. Right? If this genuinely improves outcomes for all Australians, then we should agree to compensate those who lose. That's standard economics. How you do that, without putting in place incentives to resist the change, right, is a different matter. Would you say buying reform is a bit cynical? I would say as an economist, no, we're compensating the losers out of the gains to the gainers, which are greater than those losses. And if that can't be done, then the policy is not worth doing. On price signals, absolutely, you have to find a way to do this. That's the answer to Ian's question. Without price signals, the supply doesn't respond, right? Naturally enough. That's not the only thing. This is a seamless garment. I have quite a bit to say about planning and zoning rules. You know more about planning and zoning rules than I do, but there's a mare's nest. And the word competition very rarely turns up in planning and zoning arrangements, right? Somebody actually said to me, it was a town planner, I'm sure she was being completely honest. She said to me, oh no, she says competition matters. She says, if we've already got a supermarket there, we don't want another one. And she said this in all seriousness, I mean, that's her training, right? And I said, well, I'm sorry, that's not my point, right? My point is that the fact that there's already a supermarket there ought not to be the reason that you say no. Maybe there are other reasons, aesthetics, and I mean, that's fine, right? But you ought not simply to do that by saying there's one there. And that's how you build in the idea of competition. So planning and zoning rules, which arguably are responsible for the fact that our housing market is undersupplied now, and housing is, very expensive in this country, clearly applies to public housing as well. Price signals you need to make the market work. If you're not prepared to go with price signals, forget it. The chap who had to, order his beer and his pizza, right? He had to pay the market price for his beer and his pizza, and for all I know, he rang 3 pubs and 2 pizza outlets. I don't know, right? But he got the signal, and they responded. They delivered him his pizza because he met the market price. Houses aren't pizzas, but that part of the logic, I think, carries over.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're already well over time, so please join me in thanking Professor Ian Harper.